Hi and welcome to the Monash University Health and Physical Education Proposition Conversations. In this video you'll be introduced to the key idea of valuing movement and provided with some in-practice examples.
Valuing movement. This is one that will be quite familiar to a lot of the physical education focused teachers out there. We kind of value movement in everything we do when we play games and sports and we do our physical activities as part of a physical education program.
For me, valuing movement is about thinking about the experience of movement for movement's sake. What that means for me is to really appreciate and understand that it's a fundamental right for us all to be able to move and to experience movement, but that some people don't have that opportunity or that right to do it. So I think questioning why we move comes before questioning how we're moving. So this might be a little counterintuitive for traditional approaches to physical education and sport. One of my main interests in this notion of valuing movement is bringing pleasure to a movement experience. And what I'm encouraged about with regards to the curriculum and to this proposition is that it does tend to have a focus on the inherent feelings and senses of what it's like to be embodied and in a movement moment. Whilst it doesn't explicitly say that, there is no particular reason why we can't start to think about it in that respect.
For me, two words kind of resonate with this, and that is this notion of lifelong movement and life-wide movement. So life-wide is referring to the activities and the movements we do in our everyday lives, not just inside the four walls of a phys ed class, but outside in the playground and in our life worlds at home and in our community. So we should be thinking about how do we connect and value movement in our everyday activities that are grounded in the place in which we live. The lifelong concept clearly addresses this notion that we are not just movers for the time we're in physical education, but we're preparing young people to be movers for the rest of their lives. So what are the types of activities that they're going to be engaging with, not when they're necessarily when they're 12 or 13, but when they're into middle and later adulthood as well. So we can't kind of ignore those things. And whilst we see with movement a very clear focus on sports and games, we know that for a very large portion of people, those sports and games stay relevant for a period of time, and then we transform and morph our movement experiences as we get older. So whilst we might think a tactical awareness is really important for young people to learn, it is in the context of gameplay, but it may be that we're not engaging in those kinds of activities when we get older. We know emerging forms of movement and sport participation and leisure involve a lot of informal activities that are much more social than they are about competitive or performative activities. So we also need to value those and support young people to value those because they're the kinds of activities they're likely to engage in.
For me, what this means is developing a movement mindset and a movement body set as well as a movement skill set. The inherent features of that would be based upon pleasure, what the body likes, how the body likes to move, and then the development of skills around that. So that what becomes central in valuing movement is this notion of valuing one's body or oneself in movement. And I think the key to this is diversity and variety and choices, but I also think the key to it is recognising that moving and moving well and moving successfully, or just moving at all, is a fundamental right. However, the magic experience of it is not inherent in everybody's experience in movement. When we can position ourselves outside of our valued experiences in and of movement, we can see young people's experiences in entirely different ways. There is an inherent value in moving. It feels good, it feels amazing. How do we encourage young people to have that moment, to not feel threatened by it, and to then persist in it enough to take it on into the future as a focus on something in their lifelong activities that they might be able to remember from your classes?
We have to start thinking about the social skills and how we interact with other people in movement contexts. And it might mean me giving up some of the performative stuff to enable someone else to have an enjoyable experience. How do we negotiate the aesthetic, the clothing, the body, the equipment, the resources? how do we negotiate, how do we find one of these informal sporting groups or activity groups, how do we negotiate our entry into those, and how do we as potential innovators in movement space create our own opportunities for movement and support others to come and join us. I think they're really important skills that we could look at when we start to think about valuing movement. So when we think about movement, we've got a range of different models and pedagogies we can apply. I would strongly encourage teachers move well away from the 3 to 4 week cycle of movement activities that we tend to go through, and we kind of repeat those year after year without any progression or development. So if we're going to develop real rich and meaningful understandings of movement, and we're going to value that in a context of an education, then I think we need to push towards longer units of work that really start to build these substantive ideas of, well, what does this mean to enjoy this particular movement, and what are the nuances in and around this particular movement. I also think there's a real opportunity here for creativity, for curiosity, for movement's sake, so exploring in movement as opposed to necessarily the sort of tactical side of things or the technical side of things. So open up the possibilities for movement. Think about diverse ways of moving, exploring unique ways of moving, being creative, creating new forms of movement, or even adapting existing forms of movement, changing them for your particular circumstance. Those are kind of experiences that I think will open up notions of difference and include more of your young people in those experiences and give them a place where they find movement is an enjoyable thing to do and something they can create and persist with throughout their lives.
So my example around valuing movement comes from another observation that I've had about young people and disengagement. I mean, we all know the kids who are disengaged from our classes that show a degree of disinterest. Partly sometimes they're to blame, partly, mostly I think we're to blame. So what does that mean in terms of pedagogical practices around valuing movement? Well, for me, a specific example of that would be if I'm going to think about movement and valuing it as a really embodied experience, then I have to bring embodied movement experiences to my classroom. So what that means is that young people not only would like to or need to be in a position where they can actually feel this embodied experiences, but for some young people they've never actually had them at all. So can we bring some opportunities to our classrooms to actually pre-movement and the embodied experience tell young people, inform young people, and guide them through processes of understanding what it's like to be inside their body and inside a movement moment. So an example that I would use here is a set of vignettes, case studies, poems and short stories, maybe even plays that in and of themselves are aesthetic and sense-based and feeling-based in nature. Bringing them to my classrooms for conversations, performative pieces, deconstruction and questioning provides the opportunity for those young people who perhaps do not have that physical experience to be able to have an in-classroom safe experience, to hear the resonating stories about what it means and how it feels to move, and to then be able to take them and seek them out or to experience them in their moving lives. I think getting comfort with what it means to be an embodied mover is perhaps one of the first steps to valuing movement, because it brings courage, and with that fun and pleasure and courage comes this opportunity to go out and to move and do different things in different kinds of ways.
So one of the ways I've worked with young people as a starter activity to get them thinking about movement, what movement means to them, is I've dimmed the lights in the class. We've put a couple of films up on the wall with waves crashing down, and I've read a narrative or a vignette about a surfer, and the surfer was sitting on the board. I spoke about the kind of intrinsic feelings that surfer had about feeling at peace, at ease, feeling the motion of the waves. And then we sort of went through the process of the wave coming and the exhilaration and the rush and the thrill and those kind of embodied notions of what it means to be able to surf. And through telling that vignette, I was able to frame up for these young people what in movement felt like for this particular surfer. We got another teacher in the class to read their story of completing the marathon or the half marathon, and the exhaustion and the elation and the sort of sense of fear and anxiety, but then the overwhelming sense of achievement at the end of that. And what we then did was got the young people in the class to descriptively write about a movement experience that they had. And that rich description, we asked them to use lots of adjectives. We did a think, pair, share. We did sensitizing activities. But those rich descriptions then were merged together, and we created a class Wordle, and that Wordle contained all the words that illustrated what they valued about movement. And that poster sort of served as a reference point for the rest of the activities that we went on with that semester. And so it was a really nice way to sensitize young people to the idea of why movement is important in so many different ways for so many different people.
I think a really important thing for us to think about in health and physical education is that valuing movement is also about health. It's also about how we might be able to position ourselves in the place of another person having or experiencing a particular kind of movement experience. And the embodied examples that we've given here in this clip will probably speak nicely to that. They're not running out, they're not running around, they're not tackling, they're not kicking, they're actually feeling first. And I think if you can put yourself in the place of another person in those feeling moments, it has great opportunities to co-create stories, to be able to shift what we think movement experiences are and sport are for young people, and change what they're doing at school in order to make it more closely aligned with some of the passions, drives, pleasures and fun things that they might like to do in their outside life and into the future.
Thank you for tuning in to the Monash University Health and Physical Education Proposition Conversations. Bye.